Hello, I'm Professor Ron Seyb, and thank you for joining me for my next installment in my long-running series of last lectures, what I call my last waltz. Today, we're going to be talking about the possible role or influence of independent voters on the outcome of the 2024 presidential elections. Now, most Seinfeld-savvy Americans know the story of Independent George. The George is, of course, the morally compromised, delusional, and hapless George Costanza. In one episode, George gets incensed with Jerry and Elaine because they have become friends with George's girlfriend. To George, this puts him in the untenable position of, quote, having to kill Independent George to make room for Relationship George in his future interactions with Jerry and Elaine. As he exclaims in a stentorian voice, "A George divided against itself cannot stand." Most Americans also cherish their independence. This is particularly evident in politics. Americans' relationship with the two political parties is something they would prefer to conceal from their friends. This is evidenced by the consistent finding that more Americans identify as independents than as either Republicans or Democrats. A Gallup poll conducted this past January found that 43% of Americans call themselves independents, a percentage that has been rising over the last few years. It is understandable that being independent is so on trend against the backdrop of growing inter-party dislike. That is, as a YouGov poll recently found, Democrats and Republicans are increasingly likely to dislike each other and feel hostile toward members of the other party. A person who identifies as a loyal Democrat or as a loyal Republican, when in a mixed group of people, is likely to confront at least a handful of people who will want to engage in what my mom used to call a set to, or I would call an argument. Displaying one's political independence is thus a way to build social currency. However, do independent voters actually behave as independents when casting their votes? If they are what political strategists call persuadable voters, then they could tip the 2024 presidential election either to the Democratic candidate or to the Republican candidate. The melancholy news for those who champion Independent George and his ilk is that a large majority of independent voters vote just like those who identify with one of the two political parties. A Pew Research poll conducted a few years back found that 81% of independent voters lean toward either the Republican or the Democratic Party. Pew also found that, quote, in their political attitudes and views of most issues, independents who lean toward a party are in general agreement with those who affiliate with the same party. So there's no difference between an independent who leans towards the Democratic Party and a loyal Democrat in terms of their issue positions and their voting behavior. Most independents are thus merely closeted partisans. They like the moniker or label independent because it connotes that they are free thinkers who vote for the candidate rather than for the party. Their behavior, however, demonstrates that they have a clear party preference, a preference that governs both their policy positions and their voting behavior. This data, however, should not be interpreted to mean that there are no swing voters in 2024. Exit polls from 2020 found that 38% of those who voted in that election identified as moderates. These voters supported Joe Biden by a margin of 30% over Donald Trump. Hence, it would not be unreasonable to say that both the Democratic candidate and the Republican candidate in 2024 would be well advised to target these moderate voters, since those who identify as conservatives and liberals have already made their candidate choice. They're locked in already. Appealing to moderates, however, is a bit trickier than it may seem. Political scientists divide moderates into three separate categories: true moderates, disengaged moderates, and idiosyncratic moderates. The second group, the disengaged moderates, will not be part of either campaign's calculations because they are unlikely to vote. True moderates do not have strong ideological leanings. They seek to take a centrist, or as they might term it, common sense position on most issues. Idiosyncratic moderates, on the other hand, can have strong views, but those views do not coalesce on one end of the ideological spectrum or the other. The best example of an idiosyncratic moderate is a person who says they are, quote, socially liberal but fiscally conservative. The pursuit of moderate voters thus cannot proceed in a straight line. The candidate in this election who can make the crooked path a bit straighter will likely prevail. Thank you again for joining me for this installment of my series on the 2024 presidential election.